When you use your first 360 camera, not everything will be perfect in the beginning. Your videos probably won't look the way you expected them to. That's why today we're going to take a look at what are probably the 10 most common beginner mistakes and how you can avoid them. You shoot almost exclusively in the default settings. A 360 camera can be a bit overwhelming at first. Compared to a normal camera, it's a bit more difficult to get started. You have to think about reframing, you also have to deal with the app and understand the concept of a 360 camera first. So it's obvious that you don't care about the camera settings for the time being and film everything in the default settings. But especially if the conditions are not optimal, you should deviate from the default settings and change some shooting settings. What you should not change is the resolution. This should always be as high as possible to get the best possible quality. If you swipe to the left, you open the advanced settings. Here you can set the exposure manually or choose the optimal color profile. I have already made a very detailed tutorial on the best possible settings for the X3. By the way, I'll put a list of all the additional videos I'll mention today in the video description. You're not taking lens stitching into account. As I'm sure you know, a 360 camera has two separate cameras. The shots from both cameras are then stitched together to create a single 360 image. If you look closely, you can see the transition between the two shots. Depending on the shooting situation and lighting conditions, you can see the transition more or less well. Lens stitching can therefore lead to a reduction in image quality. Most beginners are not even aware of this and do not think about it when shooting. However, you can solve the problem relatively easily. For example, if you're filming yourself, you should hold the camera so that one of the two lenses is facing exactly in your direction. The edge, that is the outside of the camera, should not look in the direction of your subject. This way, you can avoid unsightly transitions of the lens stitching relatively easily. You don't pay attention to perspective and you don't perform camera movements. When using a 360 camera, you can change the framing in post and even add movement using keyframes. But that doesn't mean it doesn't matter how you hold the camera. Despite reframing, you can't change the perspective afterwards, which means you should still pay attention to whether you take your shot directly from the front, for example, or rather from below or above. From below, your subject looks bigger and more dominant. From above, you look at the subject more like an observer. When you shoot video with a normal consumer camera, whether it's an action camera or larger camera, it's usually a good idea to add camera movements to give the shot a little more dynamics. This is also true for a 360 camera. It's true that you can also add motion when reframing. However, this cannot replace a physical camera movement. You should keep the movements very simple though. So very simple movements forward or backward. Or you move the camera from the bottom up or slightly sideways. When reframing, you can then add more movements using keyframes and combine the physical movements with the digital movements of the reframing. This way, you can get very dynamic shots. But the key is, keep it simple with the camera movements. Otherwise, the result will look very unprofessional and chaotic. For the camera movements, a pole is of course very suitable. Especially the 3 meter long pole from Insta360 gives you a lot of possibilities to perform cool camera movements. And that brings us to the next mistake. Many people always use the same mount for their 360 camera. I would say in most cases it's a pole. Of course, the pole is also the perfect mount for a 360 camera, if only because it disappears from the shot. But there are significantly more options and many of them are very interesting. To fully realize the potential of a 360 camera, you should try different mounts. Only with the right mount, you can film yourself perfectly while cycling, skiing and doing all kinds of other activities and still have both hands free. I made a very detailed video about the different 360 mounts, in which I show the most interesting mounts and accessories from Insta360 and how the footage looks with their respective mount. You can find a link to this video as well as to the mounts from Insta360 in the video description. In general, many do not fully exploit the potential of their 360 camera, which is completely normal at the beginning. A large proportion of users, and I don't just mean beginners, use their 360 camera almost exclusively in combination with a smartphone. However, video recordings are compressed to keep file sizes small and save storage space. With compression comes a reduction in image quality, and especially editing and sharing via smartphone leads to additional compression and therefore poorer image quality. If you want to get better results from your 360 camera, you should transfer your shots to a PC and edit them in the desktop app Insta360 Only in this way you avoid a strong additional compression of your recordings. And only when editing on the PC and in the desktop app, you have the possibility to choose the file format when exporting. If you want the best possible image quality, you should choose ProRes when exporting. Here, a stronger compression is avoided. As you can imagine, it also has a disadvantage. Since ProRes hardly compresses the footage, it results in relatively large files. You need a lot of space on your hard disk. And that brings us to the next problem. Many people simply copy their recordings to a hard drive without organizing them in any way. But if you don't find a way to organize your files and recordings, you'll never find certain recordings when you look for them. Your hard drives will fill up pointlessly, because you will most likely never use the shots again, because you don't know which shot is behind which file anyway. 360 recordings have a somewhat strange format. If you copy the files from the memory card to your hard disk, you will get 2 files per recording. That would be the 2 capture files of the 2 cameras of your 360 camera. Only during reframing and the following export, the 2 recordings are merged to one single video file. To reduce storage space, I recommend that you reframe all your shots as soon as possible after shooting and then save them in a special folder. When doing this, you should come up with a system for naming the folders and files. I myself usually use the mount I used and the activity that was filmed for the file name. For example, skiing with pole. You can also name the folder after the activity and maybe add a date. If you then search your files, you will very quickly find your videos of skiing, biking, surfing, and so on. I would keep the source files only in the case of very special and good shots, simply to save storage space. Many beginners simply select the preferred framing and then export the shot. They don't bother with the various features of the app. I think often they also use the tracking feature because it makes reframing longer shots much easier. There's nothing wrong with that, because tracking is a cool feature of Insta360 cameras. However, I think Insta360's app has a few very interesting features related to reframing that are often overlooked by beginners, but that you should take a closer look at. I'm referring to keyframes in particular. Only by using keyframes can you add creative, interesting movements to your shot in post-processing. You simply select the optimal framing for a certain movement in the shot and click on the plus. A keyframe is created. Now you select a different framing for a second moment in the shot and click on the plus again. As with a camera pan, the framing will now adjust and change from the first keyframe to the second keyframe. The adjustment of the framing is done evenly, and you should change this as well if you want to get a more organic result. To do this, simply click on the line between your 2 keyframes and now you have a choice of different options. The first one stands for an even adjustment. The second option changes the framing strongly at the beginning and slowly at the end. The third option slowly at the beginning and fast at the end, and so on. Try out the different options. You'll see that you get more interesting results with them than with the constant adjustment. Actually, we are already in the middle of the editing process with this, but many beginners don't learn video editing. But if you want to create better videos, and now this doesn't just apply to a 360 camera but to any kind of video camera, then you need to take a closer look at a video editing program. Seeing long clips will quickly become boring and you will lose the joy of your camera and your recordings relatively quickly. You should therefore take the time to learn at least the basics of an editing program. This does not have to be a professional program. For beginners, I recommend iMovie on the Mac. It contains all the most important features you need. On the PC, you can start with the free tool VSDC, for example. On both platforms, there are more advanced programs like DaVinci Resolve or Adobe Premiere. I use Final Cut Pro myself, but it's only available for the Mac. But really, it doesn't matter which of these programs you use. What matters is that you get a little deeper into video editing, simply to make more exciting and engaging videos. By the way, if you're looking for music for your videos, I recommend the platform Audio, which I've been using for a few years now. You'll also find a link to it in the description. You think that your 360 camera is the best choice for all situations. Unfortunately, this is a misconception. As we have already seen, a 360 camera has 2 separate sensors that create separate images. You can imagine that these are relatively small image sensors, and small sensors are not the best choice, especially in low light conditions. It's true that the image quality of the X3 in low light conditions has improved compared to the X2. Still, a 360 camera like the X3 remains more of an action camera made for shooting outdoors and in good lighting conditions. It is quite important that you are aware of this, because otherwise you will be disappointed. For example, about the recording quality indoors or in the evening. If you want to take 360 shots even in such situations, you should rather go for the Insta360 One RS 1-inch. It has 2 much larger 1-inch sensors that are better suited for low light conditions. I also don't see a 360 camera like the X3 as a full replacement for a 4K action camera. Unfortunately, the state-of-the-art in 360 cameras is not yet ready to compete with the image quality of a high-quality action camera. This also applies to the single lens mode. However, a 360 camera has other qualities, and a very special strength of the 360 camera is the possibility to take creative and interesting shots that would not be possible in this form with another camera. I have now told you a number of typical beginner's mistakes, and you can find other tutorials on 360 cameras on this channel. Nevertheless, I would like to say today that no tutorial and no guide can completely replace personal personal experience. That's why I believe that many beginners try too little themselves, test too little, simply don't film enough. Always take your 360 camera with you when there might be something interesting to capture, and just try out as much as possible. This is the only way to find out what you personally like best and how you can achieve the best results. There is simply no substitute for personal experience. Nevertheless, I would of course like to recommend to every beginner a whole series of tutorials that you can watch at any time if necessary, and that will certainly help you to make progress even faster. I'm putting together a list which you'll find in the video description as I mentioned earlier. So if this video was interesting for you, give me a like as feedback. There will be more tutorials on 360 cameras of course. Stay tuned and see you next time.